And, oh, okay. But yeah, so just like a little bit of an introduction for anybody who's not familiar with our club. We are the Olive Branch. We're on Catholic University, like at Catholic University. If anybody has not joined the club, feel free to join. We're on the Nest. Can learn new events like this. Um, but yeah. So, sorry, excuse my voice. Um, so this is Dr. Martin Shaw. For those who don't know you, for those who don't know him, he is from London. He's coming in from London time, so big thank you. It's a big time difference and everything. So we
Well,
were
it's a not a bad time, so it works. Yes.
true. Well, thank you. How are you doing today, by the way? I don't know if I asked you that.
I'm fine. I'm fine. Thank you. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay, well, that's good. So, so Dr. Martin Shaw, he is a sociologist of global politics, war and genocide, and he has a current research professor in the Institut of Barcelona de Estudis. I don't know if I.
Estudis Internacionals.
Yeah.
That's Catalan. Yeah.
Oh, okay. True.
Yeah.
Yeah, my pronunciation. I'll work on that. He is a retired or emeritus professor of international relations and politics of the University of Sussex. In addition to his PhD, he is also an author of many books, one of which is what brought our attention today, which is What is Genocide? Um, which is going to be the topic and the main focus of today's webinar. Our structure for this afternoon will be, or evening on your time, will be that he's going to give us a brief lecture. And then after the lecture, we're going to have opportunity for like Q&As, like, and whatnot. We have a form that we can share with you guys. But we do also have some like already structured questions. So if you guys don't know really what to ask, we have some of those to go back on as well. But yeah, so I guess without further ado, um, love to hear what you have to provide for us. Or me
Okay.
myself.
Well, thank you. Well, the way I thought I'd tackle this, rather than giving a formal lecture, I thought I'd talk to some of the main questions that you asked because you gave me a list of 19 questions, and with the best one in the world, I don't think I'm going to be able to answer all of those very fully. But I thought if I took some of the main issues that you've posed and talked about them, that would give us a basis for following through with further questions. So your first question you asked me was, what is genocide and why does it matter for our understanding of geopolitical conflicts? And is the definition clear cut, or can there be reasonable disagreements over what it means? So this is well, it's a big set of questions. I suppose the simple answer here is that genocide is a way of understanding uh, violence against civilians, against whole populations, and it's a modern way of understanding it. It was invented 80 years ago by Raphael Lemkin, who was a lawyer of Polish Jewish background who came to the United States during the Second World War after he fled Nazi occupied Poland, and he invented this term to describe the deliberate destruction of populations uh, by states and others, uh, something which had been going on in wars for thousands of years, of course, because violence against civilian populations has long been a part of war. But he proposed in the 1940s that we should look at this in a different way. We should see it as a distinct type of crime against civilian populations. And the background to this really is that in the beginning of the 20th century, it was beginning to be thought that we should define the limits of what was legitimate in war, that legitimate war was something which went on between armies, where armies attacked each other and fought with each other, and that the uh, violence against civilian populations should not be automatically countenanced as part of warfare. And so in the beginning of the 20th century, with the Hague regulations on the laws of war, we began to define what was legitimate in war and what wasn't, the process that's still ongoing. And Lemkin came in and he said, well, we've got to look at this in a holistic way. We've got to look at what it means when a state or some other actor targets a whole population and tries to essentially to destroy their existence or to cripple their society. And he came up with this word genocide to describe this type of violence. And that was taken up by the new what was then the new United Nations in 1948 when they drafted the Convention on the the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide, the Genocide Convention. So genocide was defined first of all by Lemkin and then by the convention, and then of course since then people have carried on arguing about what genocide means or what it should mean. And so the short answer is that there's no absolutely given meaning. We can argue about what it means, but virtually everybody who defines it argues that it is the deliberate destruction of whole societies, groups, or populations. And so there's a good degree of consensus about the core of it. There's some disagreement about precisely what that means and what types of violence should count as genocide. And it matters to international politics and to world society, obviously, because this is by any standards, when there is violence, destructive violence being carried out against a whole population group, that is a very terrible thing. And that is, in the context of our modern democratic politics, that is something which provokes enormous political attention and divisions and arguments, as we're seeing over Gaza. So it's something which once this idea has been introduced into international politics, it now has a great deal of importance, and it's something that we can't really get away from. I mean, often states which are carrying out violence against populations want to say, "Oh no, what we're doing is we're just fighting a war. The genocide has nothing to do with it. Genocide is an exaggerated charge, or it's malevolently charged against us." And that's been true just about every state or movement that has been charged with genocide over the last 80 years. They have all said that sort of thing. So the charge, of course, is for the victims and for those who want to stand up for them. It's obviously a very potent thing to say, and that's as we are seeing. We're seeing all of this in the case of Gaza, but we could talk about it in other cases as well. Before I get on to Gaza, which I obviously do want to talk about, and a lot of your questions are about Gaza, but you had another question, which was from a sociology perspective or your combined knowledge perspective, because I approach it basically sociologically, but I am also an IR scholar, and I do. When you write about something like this, you have to know about a lot of different disciplines, and international law, for example, comes into it in a big way. I'm not a lawyer, but I know quite a bit about it. So how do you think a society is able to reach a point of explicit loss of respect and dignity for human life? That's an interesting question, actually, that you're asking that. And so I suppose what we could say is that genocide, which is where you have the destruction of a whole population or group, is the culmination really of racist attitudes and lack of respect for others, which we find in all sorts of degrees in modern society. In virtually every country in the world, we can see manifestations of that, even if it doesn't go to the point of destroying whole groups. So if we think about the way in which refugees and asylum seekers are treated, not only in the United States, but in my country or in European countries, in most countries in the world, you could see that sort of lack of respect and lack of protection for the dignity of the people involved. And racist attitudes are very much implicated in this. And there's an awful lot of our politics today in many countries in the world, which involves really mobilizing hatred against particular groups of people and using racism of one kind or another. So I suppose that's the short answer to that, and it's an important aspect of this question, really, because it isn't. When we think of genocide as being something, it's completely out of off the scale in terms of evil, and it is. But there's so much other evil that exists in modern societies, which is maybe not quite at that point on the scale, but which is not too far away from it, and involves the same sorts of basic lack of respect for other people and dehumanization of other people, which happens in genocide, happens in a more mundane way, if you like, in racism and in far-right politics. Well, I think you've had some examples of that in your country in the last 24 hours. So that's a short answer to that question. The situation in Gaza as genocide and the whole Israel-Palestine situation. You'll all know obviously quite a lot about this because you've been engaged with it. I would argue that there is a sort of genocidal element to the situation in Palestine, which is deep rooted, which goes back to the fact that when the Zionist movement started to build up the Jewish population in Palestine in the early 20th century, they had this project of creating a Jewish state in Palestine, irrespective of the fact that the majority of the population that already existed were Palestinians, Arabs, and that they and so from the start, the Zionism contained this sort of tension. Really, the paradox of Zionism was that it wasn't really a Middle Eastern ideology in its origins. It's a European ideology. It comes out of Europe, where the Jewish population, especially in Eastern Europe, but throughout Europe, were discriminated against and suffered regular violence and hostility, and this pervasive racism that I was talking about. They were suffering it, and so when other groups in Eastern Europe started to demand their own states and create national movements, some Jews went down that path themselves as well, and where other Jews were involved in other sort of political movements. But they developed their own nationalist movement, but they wanted to try to transplant it to, of course, to where they believe, where the Jewish people originated from 2,000 years ago. So the tension that created with the existing population meant that was always a potential, if the Zionist movement became strong enough, for the removal or destruction of at least part of the existing Palestinian society, to, if you like, to make way for a separate Jewish society. So I would say there was a genocidal potential, if you like, in this project. But of course, that didn't mean it necessarily had to go that way. There were some Zionists who did think that it was possible to find a way of living, Jews live together with Arabs, and I think you could draw up a scenario where maybe that could have happened, so that was a potential. And then, of course, we had the situation in the middle of the last century when the Jews were being persecuted in Europe by the Nazi regime and also elsewhere, and then with the Holocaust during the Second World War, the Jews, the surviving Jews, felt that they needed to get out of Europe, and countries like the United States and Britain didn't want to let in many Jews, so they headed for Palestine, and the Zionist movement encouraged them to go, and so the Jewish population rapidly increased because of the Holocaust. The new United Nations and the major powers, both the West and the Soviet Union at the time, supported the creation of the Jewish state and voted for the partition. So this led to the situation which in 1948, when in the war that developed over the unequal partition plan in Palestine, the Zionists were able to force out the majority of the Palestinian population from the places in which they lived, something like 750,000 Palestinians, and so many of them are the refugees who they or their descendants now still live in places like the refugee camps in Gaza and in Lebanon and so on. So this from my perspective, the Nakba was a genocidal moment. It was a genocide in the sense that it destroyed. It was a deliberate destruction of the Palestinian society, or the large part of the Palestinian society. It didn't involve extensive mass murder. I mean, a lot of Palestinians were killed. There were atrocities. There were massacres, and the massacres had a function. The function really was to terrorize the rest of the population into leaving, and then the new Jewish state, the state of Israel, when it was established, refused to allow Palestinians to return. So that effectively sealed this what I would call a partial genocide of the Nakba. But then, I mean, and that said that basically they sealed the fundamental inequality of the relationship between the Israeli state and the Palestinians, which has now lasted for 3/4 of a century, and that's the underlying factor that we're dealing with here, and of course the Nakba has been continued. It's been extended by the ways in which the Israeli state and Israeli settlers especially have sought to push Palestinians out of key areas of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and the way in which Israel has blockaded Gaza, which has all basically continued the Nakba and blocked the creation of a functioning Palestinian state in the remaining parts of Palestine that aren't in Israel proper. So, I mean, that's the background, I suppose, to what we're dealing with today. And what we're dealing with today is the consequence of the way in which Hamas tried to break this situation. This is how I would explain it. And the blockade of Gaza. And this, of course, was through these brutal atrocities, which I would call them genocidal massacres, the massacres of October the 7th. You know, the fact that the Hamas and other armed Palestinian group fighters went into Gaza aiming to kill and to capture civilians. It wasn't a case of the civilians being killed accidentally as a result of an attack on military installations. It was a deliberate policy, and that's had a profound effect, I think, because I think that is part of the reason why Israel has resorted to this atrocious genocide over the last 12 months. Because the Hamas atrocities were really a trauma for not only a humiliation of the Israeli state, but also a traumatic experience for many Israelis. Not only those whose families members were killed or captured, but also really for the whole society. And it has all the racist tendencies that already existed in Israeli society, all the violence that already existed, all the assumptions that Israel could do what it wanted to the Palestinians. These were now supercharged. Really, this is how I see it. And this has led Israel to carry out this campaign. And I mean, I would say that you can't treat it simply as it's not. This isn't something which happened by accident. Because the way in which Israeli defenders sometimes present this is as though they had to destroy Hamas, and well, the Palestinian population happened to be in the way, or it was Hamas's fault that they were in the way. Well, no. I mean, regardless of whether Hamas, of whatever Hamas did, Israel can only have intended to destroy Gaza in more or less the way it has done, because it was very well known beforehand how the sort of bombing that Israel carried out in previous attacks had caused enormous destruction and very considerable civilian death. But the previous bombings in the previous wars, 2008, 2014, 2021, these wars were on a tiny scale compared to what Israel decided to do in October last year. And so I don't think we can believe that this is anything other than an intentional policy on the part of the Israeli state to destroy Gazan society, to cause huge physical suffering and all sorts of emotional suffering, and to destroy Gaza as it was before. And of course, we now see, with the way that they're operating in the north of Gaza and the way in which they are carving up the territory and aiming to completely expel the Palestinian population from the northern part of Gaza, we see the way in which this is heading towards a situation in which Gaza becomes a sort of an Israeli directly occupied territory in which Palestinians only exist on sufferance in very limited areas and in extreme poverty. And we see, I mean, I don't know if I'm going on too long, but no, I'll try and wind it up. But one of the other questions you asked about, which I think is important, is the international court cases, and both the International Court of Justice and in their instructions to Israel, which Israel has ignored, and also the International Criminal Court prosecutor in his proposed charges against Israeli leaders have focused on the way in which Israel has deliberately caused starvation and famine, and we've seen in the last couple of days the new proposal by Israel to completely outlaw UNRWA, and this really is a signal that Israel, in the face of these sort of international charges, is doubling down really on its project of totally crippling Gazan society, which from my point of view is a genocidal project. So maybe I'll stop there and give you some chance to come back.
Mute myself. Okay, so I think we already had some hands kind of popping up. If you try speaking, I don't know if you can try speaking from there. I don't know if we'll be able to catch you. Oh, okay. Sorry. Speakers. Here.
You mentioned that the International Criminal Court is focusing on how Israel is causing deliberate starvation to Gaza. Is that mostly a matter of it's easier to point to this as a deliberate war crime or as a crime against humanity? Or is it just kind of a matter of this is a very clear case and we can use this to establish precedent, whereas in an individual case where uh, a civilian is harmed, for as awful as that is, it's not necessarily like you can't necessarily establish a precedent that this constitutes a war crime or a crime against humanity.
Well, the charges, the ICC prosecutors' charges don't only refer to starvation, but it was striking that that was at the top of his list. And it's also what the ICJ has focused on in their instructions in March and May this year. So I think the reason the ICJ I think the reason both of them are focusing on these is because the most of the violence and destruction which has taken place is a result of bombing, and the bombing is ostensibly directed at Hamas. That's what Israel says, that it's directed at Hamas. We know it can't simply be the question of that, because we know from countless incidents where scores of people have been killed and wounded, that Israel is carrying out its bombing in such an indiscriminate way that it can hardly be said to be targeted against Hamas. I mean, Israel has one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world. If they wanted to target precisely, they probably could have done an awful lot more precise. I think everybody can see that. So, but because of Israel's justifications, it's a sort of grey area. Because they obviously are fighting Hamas, and that on one level appears to be legitimate, then it's mixed in with this violence against civilians. The policies which lead to starvation, on the other hand, seem to be basically directed against civilians. Banning UNRWA doesn't really harm Hamas directly in any serious way, but it does harm the civilian population, and that's quite clear. And all the agencies involved, and as well as all the Palestinian voices, are saying that. So I think that's probably the rationale. That's probably. I mean, I'm not in the room when they make these decisions, so I don't know. But that's what I would guess.
We have another question coming up.
Hello. Nice to meet you. I am wondering, do you know anything about the Yemeni and Egyptian intelligence that said that the October 7th attack was a thing and that Israel didn't they knew about it? Do you know anything about that? I'm not sure.
Well, I'm not especially well informed on that. I mean, I don't have any special knowledge. I mean, what I would say is that it is quite clear that Israel knew quite a lot about the preparations for an attack of this kind that Hamas had been making over some time, because they hadn't hidden them particularly well. And Israel did have specific intelligence just before the attacks that something was going to happen, and they didn't take any notice of it. And of course, once it was underway, the Israeli commanders who were first notified about it decided that it wasn't really necessarily anything very serious. So they, at all sorts of levels, Israel failed to prepare for this and failed to prevent something which they could have prevented. I think there's a deeper level here, actually, of course, which is that Israel was very complacent had become complacent about Gaza and about Hamas. I think they felt that they had tamed Hamas, that they had got a situation which they could manage, and clearly they were wrong. And because of that, they had concentrated their troops in the West Bank, So there were 32 Israeli units in the West Bank. There were 2 on the Gaza border at the time of the October 7th attack. So, Israel could easily, if it had had a more defensive allocation of its forces, it could easily have prevented what happened. But it didn't, and that was because the Israeli state was supporting the settler aggression and expansionism in the West Bank, and thought the West Bank was more important and that there was more active sort of conflict there.
Um, Hi. While we're sort of on the subject of October 7 and the Hamas attack, I was wondering if you could go in a little bit deeper on just sort of some of the motivations behind Hamas's attack and sort of the underlying, some of the recent factors that might have went into that might have went into their motivations for the attack.
Well, I think Hamas has said quite a bit, and I mean, I think there's quite a lot of evidence out there about how this built up. I mean, I think the basic situation was that Hamas and indeed the Gazan population were trapped in a sense, and that this blockade had been going on for such a long period of time. There was a bit of easing of it, which was benefiting some Gazan Palestinians who were able to go and work in Israel. That sort of thing was happening, but from Hamas's point of view, there was nothing really in the situation which offered the possibility of a change of the balance of forces between them and Israel, and clearly this assault on October 7th was a very dramatic attempt to shift the balance. And of course, it was an attempt which succeeded probably beyond what they thought was possible, because they probably didn't expect Israel to be quite as incompetent in dealing with it. And they also they took advantage. Hamas took advantage, and the other armed groups took advantage of circumstances. So, for example, it's not clear that they knew about the Nova Music Festival, but there were hundreds of young Israelis, and they were included them in the violence that they were planning to carry out, and so it became a bigger thing maybe even than they intended. But it was intended. I can't see any way you can understand it except as a way of trying to break out. But the only thing I would repeat is that it was a way of breaking out that, because it's involved these big atrocities against civilians, was something else. It was something out of the pattern that had happened before of armed attacks against Israel that Hamas and other groups had carried out. It was a very radically new event, and I think Hamas must have known that Israel would retaliate in a very big way. They maybe didn't know precisely how Israel would go with it, but they, having seen what Israel had done in the past, when in response to much lesser provocations from Hamas, then Hamas must have understood that Israel would largely destroy Gaza in response, and so in a sense, I think they do share a blame have a share of the blame for the terrible suffering which the Gazan population has had. And clearly quite a lot of Gazans are not very happy with Hamas. Israel is fundamentally responsible for the whole situation, but Hamas's stances have not helped.
Unmuted. Here, you can try. Sorry.
Can you hear me, Dr. Shaw? No.
Yes.
I'll just come up here anyway.
Sorry.
Yeah, thanks for everything you've shared with us so far. I wanted to ask you about scholars of genocide.
Yes.
And what so of course in the United States and Western Europe, even it's controversial in public discourse to even to talk about Israel's actions as genocide, even though I think any credible scholar that I've encountered recognizes it pretty clearly as genocide. I wanted to ask you whether within the sort of community of scholars who study genocide, whether there's basic consensus that what Israel is carrying out as a genocide. And then secondarily, I'm also curious about the countries that, for example, have supported the ICC case, whether any scholars in Ireland or Spain or anywhere have participated in governmental discussions about this or have contributed anything about as far as building the case. So I'd be interested in what you know about that. Thank you.
Well, on the latter point, I don't. I mean, these are not countries where genocide scholarship is strongly developed. Actually, none of those countries, I think, are countries that one thinks of when one thinks about the clusters of genocide scholars. So I don't think genocide scholars have had a great deal of input. Certainly in the case of Spain, which I know a little bit about because of my role in Barcelona, I don't think that's the case. But I think it's much more from, it's come much more out of the political communities and the different political orientations. I'm not sure I can explain it fully, but in the case of Ireland, I think it comes to some extent out of their own experience of imperialism and colonialism at the hands of the British over a long period of time, and different sorts of sympathies. In the case of Norway, maybe out of the work of the Norwegian Refugee Council, which is a particularly important actor in the Palestinian territories, and of course Norway was the sponsor of the Oslo process, so I think they feel a particular responsibility. So I think that there are these national factors, but they're not particularly to do with. I mean, there may be that there are intellectuals who have played a significant role, but I'm not really aware of them. In the academic community, the whole question of Palestine has had a paradoxical sort of significance. I mean, it hasn't actually been at all mainstream to recognise the Nakba as genocide. I mean, that has not been the dominant position. A lot of the genocide discussion in the Western world in the last few decades has started from an assumption that genocides are something like the Holocaust, and that they tend to involve the large scale of mass killing that the Holocaust involved. And of course, the Nakba, although it did involve mass killing, it was on a small scale. And the much bigger phenomenon of the Nakba was the mass expulsions. So from within the academic field, it hasn't been at all a majority position. When I and one or two other people started to approach Palestine in this way 15, 20 years ago, that was very controversial. But what has happened over Gaza is that some people who were avoiding genocide language have now changed tack. So Ilan Pappé, who you probably know of, well-known critical Israeli scholar who wrote a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. So he wrote about the Nakba as ethnic cleansing. Now, and he avoids completely in his book the word genocide, because I think he must have felt that was outside the scope of what would be accepted as legitimate. And in order to make his case, it was better to talk about ethnic cleansing. So that was published 17 years ago or something like that. Obviously, but during the present crisis, he has talked very consistently about the Israeli genocide in Gaza. even more interesting in a way is the position of Omar Bartov. You may have read some of his writing. He's another Israeli genocide scholar who written a Holocaust scholar. And when I first wrote about the Nakba as a case of genocide, he was very angry, in fact, and he more or less denounced me. And we had a debate that was civilized, but in the last paragraph of his final contribution, he more or less denounced me as trying to besmirch Israel. But that was 15 years ago. Today, when he's seen what's happening in Gaza, he says, actually, no, this is a genocide. He started out saying there's a risk of genocide, and now he says, yes, it is a genocide. So there's been a shift. And so from that point of view, for this field, it's a big change, really, having to confront the whole Israel-Palestine situation, which most people have tried to avoid or have not considered or not brought into their work. That's a change, and it's it's opening up some interesting lines of discussion, as well as some possibilities for mobilizing people against what's going on.
Do you think if you speak loud enough, you'd be able to? Oh, or you can come up.
Can you hear me?
I heard something, yes.
Oh, sure.
You mentioned the fact that Hamas almost certainly knew that Israel would retaliate, maybe not in this strong of a way, but certainly something comparable to it. I'm trying to figure out how to phrase my question. Do you think that there is anything that we can learn about Hamas from this, or anything that is like interesting to I apologize if I'm coming across as vague, but if there is anything about Hamas that we can learn about how they think and how they operate, and what their motivations are, even if they're willing to carry out an attack like this that is unlikely to succeed in any meaningful way, but will almost certainly bring horrific suffering on Gaza itself. I apologize if that's an overly broad question, but
no, I think it's an interesting question, because I think we do need to think about what kind of actor Hamas is, and I think it's important that we don't go down the road of simply saying it's a sort of evil terrorist organization any more than we should go around the road of saying this is a wonderful resistance movement. I think it's actually, we need to look at it as fundamentally a Palestinian nationalist movement, but one with a strong Islamist orientation and a strongly authoritarian makeup. And in many ways, Hamas has been, in the last 15 years, the flip side of the right-wing authoritarian trend in Israel itself, in the Israeli right wing, and in the Israeli state. It's I suppose we can understand. We can only understand these actors, both actors, as actors who are trying to achieve certain sorts of political goals. In the case of Israel, to maintain their dominance. In the case of Hamas, to somehow break that down and to extend their own control. But in a situation, in changing situations, in situations where more extreme violence seems to be needed, and so we see this radicalization. We see the radicalization in the case of Hamas in October 7th. We've seen the radicalization of Israeli policies over a very long time, leading up to this terrible genocide of the last 12 months, because and there's an interaction between the two. it's not that what either is simply inherently evil in themselves, or there's a lot of evil there, but it is the fact that they in response to the political situations they face, they opt for more and more extreme actions. And I think that's what we need to see, this dynamic really in this conflict. That's especially the way that Israel has responded to Hamas's own radicalization with an even greater radicalization of its policies.
So I don't know, can you hear me from where the speaker is?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I actually had a question kind of like tying into more of like a looking into the future and everything. So with how everything is, I mean, I think at this point we understand like that a lot of this stuff was definitely like there's like a idea of like the possible outcomes and everything, and that has brought, like, from my understanding, listening to like Hamas's description of how they did everything, there's a stance of trying to build instability within Israel, and kind of thinking about like the youth of the Israelis, the youth of the Palestinians. And because I remember like listening to one of your previous interviews or talks that you're describing something along the lines of that Israel specifically didn't say that what they were doing to Palestine and Gaza, or like even in the past, or like specifically what they're doing in Gaza, as it's not a genocide, because then they'd have to take accountability for everything that they did in the past. In addition, or no, I mixed it up. I'm sorry. That they didn't say that what Hamas did to the Israelis,
Yes,
October 7th, wasn't a
that was something that interested me. That I mean, Israeli propagandists and leaders talked about a pogrom, and they talked about links to the Holocaust, but they didn't invoke the idea of genocide as such to describe what Hamas did. And my feeling was that this was probably because they knew that if the argument became about genocide, then very quickly that would be turned against them. So it was only when South Africa brought their case to the International Court of Justice, and South Africa is saying that Israel is committing genocide, that Israel said, well, if anybody's committing genocide, it's Hamas. So they turned it. At that point, they had nothing more to lose. So that's something about the way the rhetoric plays a part in these things. Yeah.
And so, like, with that in mind, like, I'm almost wondering, like, what is, like, how do you think, really looks like for the future of, Palestine and Israel? Like, how are we going to find their, like, from, like, a sociology perspective, like, what do you think the, like, change might be, like, within the societies with, like, because, I mean, at this point, in my opinion, I think there's a lot of, attention and a lot more awareness on Palestine and the history of Palestine. And in addition to with the ICJ, like they just, I think it was yesterday or something, they just like submitted so many like it was like stacks on stacks of like, all this paperwork. And I'm wondering, I'm like, wow, okay, so you can't really turn your head as easily away from this stuff. Like
no, and it is no, I think. Well, I'd say on the one hand, I would say that Israel has been radically delegitimized by what it has done over the last year. I think a lot of people who have been largely uncritical of Israel, or who have said, well, maybe Israel does some things that they shouldn't do, but basically they have a right to exist and they need to defend themselves. There are a lot of people, I think, who would have sat in that sort of position who today are thinking, maybe there's something a bit more going on, that a bit more wrong, and I think there's a greater recognition really in, if you like, in the liberal left, the centre left in Western countries, of the problematic nature of the Israel link. But at the moment there's very little willingness to do anything about it. You're seeing with Biden and Harris that they're not really willing to budge. Significantly on this, and that Harris has not even done the limited gestures that she could have done to accommodate the pro-Palestinian cause within the Democratic Party, and I think that's it's very, very striking. And we could see the same sort of thing in Europe. We see the same sort of thing in Germany and in Britain. In Britain, the government, we have got a new government which has made some significant shifts compared to the previous right-wing government, but which are still fundamentally in support of Israel, and is making these shifts so as to not be quite so vulnerable to left-wing and Muslim criticism. So I think we're looking at it in those terms. We're in a period where things are changing, but there's still a lot of resistance. Looking at them in larger geopolitical terms, in terms of where Palestine and Israel are going, I think it's clearly the geopolitics of it has changed. It's all been ramped up enormously. It's become tied up with these, even more tied up with these huge regional tensions between Israel and Iran, and Iran and the Arab states. It's very difficult, really, to see exactly where it's going to go. But it's certainly taken centre stage in world politics in a way that it's not going to very easily go away. I'm not sure I've really got any, I haven't got a crystal ball really, to tell you where things are going to move. You talk about the International Court of Justice with the 750 pages of evidence that South Africa submitted. Well, that's very interesting, and it'll be very interesting to those of us who are still following it in whenever it is 2, 3, 4 years time, when they finally get round to adjudicating the case. But that's not helping the people of Gaza, is it? It's this juncture between. International justice, I think, is an important arena, and there have been some important things happening there, but it can't shift things by itself. Even if the judges of the ICC had granted the arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, which they should have done by now, even if they had done that, with the United States and other countries standing against that, it's not going to be very easy for it to be effective. Without the Security Council being able to act and back up the ICC. If in the perfect system, perfect working of the international system, these international legal institutions would work together with the Security Council, and the Security Council would act on behalf of the whole world to enforce international law. Well, we can see that isn't happening, and it's not going to happen anytime soon, as long as the US takes the positions it does, or indeed, for that matter, as long as Russia and China take the positions they do. We're stuck in this very difficult situation. The people in Gaza, obviously, more than anyone, but those of us who want to support and help people in Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere, we're also in these sort of binds resulting from these difficult politics.
Thank you.
If I can, I have a couple questions, sort of unrelated to each other. So I'll ask the first one, which is that recently there was a article that stated that the U.S. has provided about 70% of military equipment that Israel has used since October 7th. I'm just curious, what is the obligation or is there any precedent even for such a level of involvement in a genocide? And what does that potentially mean for the ICJ case? Could this implicate actors like Blinken, who, based on clear documentation, it's evidence that he has lied to Congress about Israel allowing aid into Gaza so that the shipments of military shipments could continue to Israel?
Well, in principle, yes. I mean, in principle, US leaders and leaders of other Western countries who have supplied weapons to Israel, Germany in particular, countries which have provided logistical support for Israel, which would include the United Kingdom. These countries and their leaders, their military chiefs are all potentially implicated. And if you look at the Genocide Convention, one of the clauses, one of the acts which shall be punishable is complicity in genocide. And I think there's a very much an arguable case for that. It isn't entirely unprecedented. I'm not sure I've got chapter and verse, but really you have to think that most of the genocides of the last 3/4 of a century have been committed by, most of them haven't been committed by the great powers. They've been committed by like second-tier regimes, which have been supported by either by the United States or by the Soviet Union or Russia, and so it's quite a normal situation, unfortunately, that other states are implicated in atrocities that are carried out and bear responsibility. Whether what's new in this situation, I suppose, is that it's so high profile, it's so central to world politics. It's become so central to world politics. Most other genocides don't become so central. What's going on in Sudan is certainly a genocidal element to that, but we're not having a Zoom about that, and the International Criminal Court is not issuing high profile charges and so on. It's not part of it. It's not in the US election. It's and the same for any other case you want to mention. So what's important here, I think, is that this has become so high profile and it has become so central, and it will continue to have big reverberations. And we can only hope that at some point this not only will Israel lose out on this, but the United States and other countries will start to shift their positions on this. I mean, there's, I suppose, a big elephant in the room here is, what happens if Donald Trump becomes president of the United States in 10 days' time, and bad as things are under Biden and Harris, it looks very much as though they could become worse if Trump comes in, and that's there's no accident that Netanyahu is rooting for him. So I think we have to deal with these difficult politics. We have the same situation in my country, really, where we're suffering from this far right government effectively for 8-10 years, and we wanted to get rid of it, but the main vehicle we had to get rid of it was the Labour Party, which was deeply compromised on Gaza.
In fact, I think Ilan Pape, who you mentioned, has a new book about the Zionist lobbies across the Atlantic. I don't know if you've.
I haven't read it, but I know about it. Yeah.
And then just really briefly, I know our time's basically up, but one thing I did want to touch on, and I sort of waited to see if it would come up naturally, was in your work describing genocide, you've often brought up this idea that it's not just ethnic, religious, racial destruction of civilian populations, but also this idea of a social destruction. I wondered if you could touch on that even just briefly, because I find that quite interesting.
Well, the idea of social destruction is important because some people try to define genocide very narrowly as physical destruction, and it seems to me that social groups and societies are constituted through social relationships that the destruction of a society is always the destruction of those relationships, of those social networks, as well as the physical violence against individuals. So that's why it plays a very important part in my thinking, because I'm always thinking of genocide as a social phenomenon. Sorry, there was something else in what you said I was going to respond to. It's gone out of my mind now. Do you want to come back? I missed something that.
Sure. Yeah. Basically, I was just saying about religious, racial.
Oh yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the discussion of genocide gets hung up on the particular types of group. Ethnic group, religious group, racial groups, and so on. And in fact, these different types of group are so-called are not fixed entities. They're not impermeable categories. Nations and ethnic groups are very very similar in many obvious ways, but also so religious groups and ethnic groups often map onto each other, and political communities also offer a map onto ethnicity and religion. So really, my argument is that the important thing is in genocide is not precisely how a group is defined or how the perpetrators define that group. It's an interesting and it's a consequential fact, but it's not necessarily the crucial thing. The crucial thing is the fact that the perpetrators are trying to destroy what is essentially a civilian population and a civilian society. And whether they define that as ethnic, political, or religious, or in whatever terms, that is the core of it, and that's what I want us to focus on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for answering all these questions. We're pretty much out of time.
Yeah, I'm afraid I have to go anyway. But it's been really interesting to talk to you all, and I hope it's been some use.
It's been awesome. We really appreciate it. And I know you have just like an opportunity, you have like some new books you're publishing. There's one I just saw that's like in the process of getting out.
I'm writing a book called The Return of Genocide, about the idea of genocide after Gaza, really, and so
definitely be
bringing together some ideas that I haven't expressed fully elsewhere. So yeah, but that won't be out till next year. So yeah,
Awesome.
Looking forward to it.
Okay.
Yeah, and thank you again for doing this. Pro bono and sort of we have discussed using some of our funding to pick up some of your books for the club members. So we really
We're having the meeting tonight.
Okay,
especially bored.
well, good luck, and don't forget other people's books as well. I think reading is important.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Nice to meet you all, and have a good evening. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. Have a good one.
Take care. Thank you so much
Thank you.
again.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.